second presentation by Robert Ziegelmann, who is a philosopher specializing in critical theory, social and political philosophy. Currently, he is a postdoctoral fellow at the Rosenzweig Minerva Center in Jerusalem. His PhD is from Humboldt University, and it focused on the role of utopian anticipation in the left Hegelian social theory. And prior to being at the Minerva Center in Jerusalem, he was a fellow at the Hanover Institute of Philosophical Research. And he will talk about a photograph of earthly life from the perspectives of the redeemed, Kafka as a model for social critique in Krakauer, Benjamin, and Adorno. Please.
Now that I heard the title that I chose, became quite obvious to me that this is not going to happen today in 20 minutes. So I'll basically just focus on Adorno. I'll mention Krakauer and Benjamin, but I'll mostly talk about Adorno's Minima Moralia. I kind of suppose that you're familiar with that book. If not, it might still be interesting to hear what Adorno says about its method. That's a quite famous quotation from the end of the book, where he says that the only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in face of despair is the attempt to view all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Knowledge has no light but that shed on the world by redemption. Perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. I'll talk about this idea of a standpoint of redemption in the next 20 minutes. What I want to mention here is just that if we suppose that Adorno has tried in this very book to practice philosophy responsibly, then we can assume that he has also tried to look at the phenomena that he's discussing from the standpoint of redemption, since that's the only way which things can be done, apparently. And what I want to talk about is that Adorno, interestingly, develops this idea of a standpoint of redemption, Standpunkt der Erlösung, by engaging the work of Franz Kafka. There's a also quite famous letter to Walter Benjamin where he starts with the following words: "Do not take it for immodesty." That's a letter from 1934, so a couple of years before Minima Moralia. "Do not take it for immodesty if I begin by confessing that our agreement in philosophical fundamentals has never impressed itself upon my mind more perfectly than it does here," which is in Benjamin's essay on Kafka. Let me only mention my own earliest attempt to interpret Kafka 9 years ago, that would be 1925. I claimed he's a photograph of earthly life taken from the perspective of the redeemed. So here again we have this idea of a standpoint of redemption. So the connection to Minima Moralia should be obvious. And I think it's also interesting that Adorno takes it as a sign for agreement in philosophical fundamentals that they have a similar view on Kafka. In the same letter, he calls this idea of a standpoint of redemption, or of looking at the world as if from a standpoint of redemption, inverse theology, meaning that it is not so much us looking at God, but in a way our attempt to look at ourselves, at our social practices, as if from God's perspective. So it's inversed in that sense, the perspective is inversed. In this letter, as you see, Adorno claims that this idea is his own idea about Kafka. Actually, it is very much influenced by what Siegfried Krakauer has written on Kafka in the 1920s, I'm not going to get into that today, because for me it's more interesting to think a little bit about how this works. Like, whoever invented this idea, just how is it possible to look at our life from the perspective of the redeemed life, or from the perspective of God. And in order to do that, I propose to look at Adorno's Aufzeichnung zu Kafka. That is his own essay on Kafka, which appeared also in the 1950s, but Adorno has worked on it for 2 decades, basically. And I think this approach is promising because in Minima Moralia, Adorno does not at all elaborate how this standpoint of redemption might be achieved. But he does tell us quite a lot about what Kafka does in his works. And given that Kafka apparently manages somehow to achieve this standpoint, I want to try to see how Adorno reads Kafka, and then reach some conclusions about how also Adorno is probably proceeding in his Minima Moralia and in his social philosophy more broadly. So let's start with a passage from that work of Adorno's, where Adorno again describes Kafka's work in terms of inverse theology. Here I read the German because there are some issues with the translation. Absolute Entfremdung wird durchforscht als Hölle aus der Perspektive der Erlösung. That is in Kafka. Adorno's talking about Kafka now. Sein Werk fingiert einen Ort, von dem her die Schöpfung so durchfurcht und beschädigt erscheint, wie nach ihren eigenen Begriffen die Hölle sein müsste. So that's this idea of durchfurcht und beschädigt. That's an obvious parallel to the end of Minima Moralia again. I tried to highlight that in different colors. I don't know if you can see it. That's the green one. In Minima Moralia, it's the rifts and crevices that Adorno mentions. And in blue, we here have Adorno's suggestion that this kind of perspective must be fashioned, in German hergestellt. And he also talks about this not being a mere reconstruction. That is, and I take it to mean it's a construction, it's not a reconstruction. So there's some sort of distinctly constructive activity that is going on here, and it's even more striking with regard to Kafka, because Adorno says Kafka feigns this kind of standpoint, fingiert in German. But how does Kafka do that? How does he succeed in feigning this standpoint or construct this standpoint? Let's have a look at how Adorno describes one of Kafka's literary devices. Kafka's subject passes from one desperate and hopeless situation to the next. The stations of the epic adventure become those of a modern passion. The closed complex of immanence becomes concrete in the form of a Flucht von Gefängnissen in German. The English translation, a flight from prisons, is misleading, and I mention that because it really points us to how not to understand that, because there cannot be a flight from the prisons. In German, Flucht von Gefängnissen really means there's one prison after the other. It's a series of prisons, and one that you precisely cannot escape from. But if there is no way out, then the question emerges, how is it still hell from the standpoint of redemption, or how does the standpoint of redemption come in here? I think the answer lies in how Adorno describes the relation between what he presents, that is phenomena of ordinary life, and the extraordinary. This is immediately after this passage that I just read. Adorno continues, in the absence of contrast, the monstrous becomes the entire world, the norm, whereas the unreflective adventure novel, by concentrating on extraordinary events, thus confirms the rule of the ordinary. And then he goes on, in Kafka, however, reason is at work. By making madness the stylistic principle, the objective insanity is allowed to emerge. Okay, how does it work if the monstrous becomes the norm? then how can we still examine the social world as hell? Or it doesn't have to be as hell, but how can we still examine it critically at all? Doesn't this presuppose some sort of contrast with something better? That is, a contrast with some sort of ideal, with a norm, a utopia, whatever. That's, of course, it's a huge debate in Adorno scholarship and in social philosophy more broadly. If there can be something like negativism that is, well, basically saying what is bad without saying what is better. And also the whole debates about ideal and non-ideal theory. I cannot go into that today. What I want to suggest is that in some way there also is a normative contrast in how Adorno presents things, but it is not explicit. The contrast is not on the level of content. Adorno very explicitly places Kafka in the tradition of enlightenment. This is when he says in Kafka, reason is at work, for example. However, this is not by virtue of the content, but by virtue of the form. As he says here, it is through the stylistic principle. And I think the way to understand this is that the normative contrast does not disappear, but it changes place, as it were. It shifts and changes its position. And I think that this is one of the reasons why Adorno talks about, he uses the word versetzt, yeah, die Welt versetzt sich. And this displacement is, I think, linked to what I just tried to explain. So the contrast is established not between different elements of what Adorno presents, but more between the whole of what he presents and the position from which we look at it. And I think that's basically how the standpoint of redemption is constructed or feigned, through a certain way of presenting things. We then do not compare facts and norms, but it's more that we look at facts through a specific perspective that is in itself normative. Adorno explains this procedure when he talks about Benjamin's Einbahnstraße, and I basically just take this also as a description of what Adorno is trying to do himself. There he says, the absurd is presented as though it were self-evident in order to disempower what is self-evident. And he continues a little bit later that this procedure provokes habituated defensive reactions in the reader, it ironically assumes. In order for the assumed reader to react in this way, that is to get defensive, their fundamental self-understanding has to be put into question. More precisely, I think Kafka's, or let's say Adorno's Kafka's strategy is to undercut those distinctions that the respective self-understanding rests on. There's an example for that that is occurring in Minima Moralia, and that's the equation of human and animal behavior. So there's a fundamental distinction that is somehow undercut by Adorno's way of presenting things. It is in the context of Adorno talking about sexual relations and what he calls patriarchal society. It can be quite disturbing in some ways, but I'll try to make sense of it. He writes, he describes a woman reacting to male advances. It's an example from literature. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just noting that he's basically trying to explain her behavior by having recourse to, I quote, an archaic frigidity, the female animal's fear of copulation, which brings it nothing but pain. And then he goes on and says, pleasure is a late acquisition, scarcely older than consciousness. So very large perspective here. I think in light of Adorno's remarks on Kafka and what I just quoted what Adorno says about Benjamin, I think statements like this should not be taken to actually allow biology into social critique, and also not to make any claims about non-human animals in any way. Rather, their aim is to exaggerate social phenomena to the point of absurdity while still presenting it as self-evident. The reaction that this aims at occurs precisely because it is constitutive for our self-understanding that we are different from animals. So there's this fundamental demarcation of humans from animals, and it's just ignored without any further explanation. Of course, blurred lines between humans and animals is also something that we know from Kafka, and both Adorno and Benjamin comment on that. I'll just take what Benjamin says on that. You can read Kafka's animal stories for quite a while without realizing that they are not about human beings at all. When you finally come upon the name of the creature, monkey, dog, mole, you look up in fright and realize that you're already far away from the continent of man. And I think that's more or less also what Adorno is trying to do. So what makes the reader look up in fright is that animals here are acting like humans. And then thereby suddenly, in the way Benjamin describes it, a gap opens up. What appeared close and familiar then suddenly turns out to be far away, as Benjamin says. On this reading, animals for Kafka are a means to recover what humans have collectively forgotten. That's what Benjamin says. And it is in this sense also that he writes that the animals are not the goal, but one cannot do without them. So they're a necessary means to reach some goal. And I think for Adorno too, animals, and especially animals in Kafka, are not really an end in themselves, but a means for human self-reflection. This is quite obvious in the last quote that I'll read today, which is from a different context. It's from what Adorno says on some part of Mahler's Third Symphony. There Adorno writes, through animals, humanity becomes aware of itself as impeded nature and of its activity as deluded natural history. For this reason, Mahler meditates on them. For him, as in Kafka's fables, the animal realm is the human world as it would appear from the standpoint of redemption, which natural history itself precludes. So here we again have the standpoint of redemption, which really occurs throughout Adorno's work. And also, as Adorno always does, he notes the impossibility of actually adopting that standpoint. But I think we now at least have a slightly better understanding of how this standpoint can nevertheless be constructed. It is by looking at humans the way we commonly look at animals, or think of Benjamin's connection between animals and the repressed past. It is by looking at the present the way we usually look at the past, and more specifically some past that we think to have overcome long ago. So it's not just like not just yesterday, but something that it has to be constitutive for our self-understanding that we're not like that anymore. Like it's also important for us that we're not animals. Another way to describe this procedure is history is turned into nature. And I think that's why Adorno uses the term natural history in this context. There could also a lot be said about this because it's another of these very important but also completely enigmatic concepts that Adorno has, like the one of a standpoint of redemption. It also has its roots in Benjamin, but what I want to suggest here is simply that natural history is what history looks like from the standpoint of redemption. So, very simply put, history appears as nature. Or, in light of what we have seen, and more precisely, it is by presenting everyday practices in terms of that from which they are usually differentiated that the standpoint of redemption is constructed or feigned. as Adorno says with regard to Kafka. Adorno's method then creates distance by means of analogy. We look at our own life, at our own social practices, like we usually look at its constitutive other. This way of presenting things then estranges what usually we take for granted. It turns out that what is close and familiar is actually something that is, in Benjamin's words again, far away. So I think that's the most general way to describe Adorno's procedure that he describes with this notion of a standpoint of redemption, to present something in terms of its constitutive other, humans as animals, the present as some distant past, history as nature. Now, of course, the next step would be to actually look at how Adorno applies this method in Minima Moralia. I think he does it to some extent, but I really can't say anything about that today, and I'll just have to leave it at that. Thanks.